The icy chill of winter enveloped the grim streets of East End, casting a somber pall over the narrow alleys. Edward Carlisle, aged 26, crouched in a darkened corner, his tattered coat offering little defense against the biting cold. His once brilliant blue eyes, once alight with hope, now shimmered with exhaustion and despair. Edward could not recall the last time he had eaten a proper meal. The gnawing ache of hunger forced his gaze upward, following the well-dressed gentlemen and ladies emerging from a nearby upscale eatery. Yet he could never bring himself to beg. His pride, the sole possession he had left, forbade it. Suddenly, a young woman stepped gracefully from a carriage. Lillian Harrington, the daughter of Lord William Harrington, appeared adorned in a pristine white fur cloak. Her gaze fell upon Edward, and her eyes brimmed with compassion. "Are you hungry?" Lillian asked softly. Before Edward could muster a reply, she handed him a bag of warm bread, her eyes shimmering with empathy. Edward accepted the bag with trembling hands, his eyes misting over. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "Just keep living," she replied gently, a warm smile gracing her lips. "You'll find hope." The scene did not escape the watchful gaze of Margaret Harrington, Lillian's stepmother. Renowned for her aristocratic poise but veiled cruelty, Margaret sat rigidly in the intricately adorned carriage, her fox fur stole quivering with the carriage's rhythmic sway. Her pale gray eyes swept over the alley where Lillian bent to offer a bread bag to a ragged man. A faint smirk tugged at Margaret's lips, not one of approval but of thinly veiled contempt. "Lillian, what are you doing?" Margaret's icy voice rang out, reverberating in the confined space of the carriage, making the cold air feel even more biting. Lillian turned, her hand still brushing against the bag she had just given away. Under the dim glow of street lamps, her striking blue eyes shone with a quiet defiance, though her voice remained impressively calm. "I'm simply helping someone in need, Mother," she said, her fingers tightening around the edges of her cloak, grounding herself against Margaret's cutting stare. Margaret raised an eyebrow, Lillian's composure only heightening her irritation. "Helping someone in need?" she mimicked, a dry chuckle escaping her throat. "You are a Harrington, not a street-side philanthropist. Actions like these, Lillian, tarnish our family's name." "What harm can a small act of kindness do?" Lillian countered, her voice soft but laced with undeniable resolve. "If you look closer, Mother, you'll see he's a person, not a shadow. He deserves dignity." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with cold displeasure. "Do not let your father hear of this," she warned. "He will not be pleased. I've told you countless times, our family does not dispense charity. The Harrington name commands respect, not foolish naivety." Lillian held her stepmother's gaze, a quiet storm brewing within her chest. She had long wanted to rebel, to shout that dignity extended beyond opulence and hollow accolades. But she knew Margaret was not one to be swayed. Margaret controlled the household like a tempest, and standing against her felt like facing an unyielding gale. "I understand," Lillian murmured, lowering her eyes, though her fists clenched tightly at her sides. She stepped into the carriage, but within her, seeds of discontent and defiance were beginning to take root. Margaret, mistaking Lillian's quiet acquiescence for submission, signaled for the coachman to resume their journey. Yet, in her eyes lingered a shadow of suspicion as she thought of the man in the alley. "A filthy rat," she mused, "but perhaps a useful pawn." Unspoken schemes began to form in her mind, spreading like shadows in the hushed confines of the carriage. Lillian could not erase Edward's image from her mind. His azure eyes, though weary and laden with suffering, held a flicker of warmth she had never encountered before. There was a quiet pride about him, a dignity not easily subdued, stirring an inexplicable mixture of curiosity and pity within her. Night after night, as she sat by her window, gazing down at the fog-shrouded streets, she found herself wondering, how could a man like him be driven to such depths of despair? One afternoon, Lillian secretly gathered a bundle of bread and slices of cured meat from the kitchen. She persuaded a servant to drive her to the same dim alley where she had first encountered Edward. Standing there once more, the stark contrast between her privileged world and his unforgiving reality struck her with raw poignancy. Edward looked up as she approached. He still appeared worn, but his eyes lit with a faint glimmer of hope at the sight of her. "Miss Harrington," he greeted softly, his voice hoarse yet gentle, as though uttering her name itself offered him a fragment of solace. "Call me Lillian," she said, smiling as she extended the bundle toward him. "You don't have to keep your distance." Hesitating, Edward eventually took the bundle, his frail hands trembling slightly. "Thank you. I don't know what to say, but you shouldn't trouble yourself. I don't want to burden you." "This isn't trouble," Lillian replied, seating herself on the steps beside him, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. "Sometimes we all need a little help." Edward gave a faint smile, one tinged with both gratitude and disbelief. "You're unusual, Lillian. A lady from your standing taking an interest in someone like me?" Lillian was silent for a moment, gazing out at the horizon where the sun dipped behind a row of crumbling buildings. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Maybe because I see in you something special, a strength you might not even realize you possess. And perhaps," she added with a soft laugh, "I want to witness it shine someday." Through clandestine meetings that followed, Lillian and Edward began to share more of their stories. With each conversation, Edward revealed fragments of his life, pieces of a tale marred by heartbreak, but not devoid of resilience. "My father passed when I was a boy," Edward recounted, his eyes fixed on the distant void. "He was a kind man, devoted to me. But then my stepmother came, a woman of beauty and charm, but beneath it all calculation. After my father died, she seized everything and discarded me as though I never existed." His voice wavered slightly, yet he held his head high. A faint, bitter smile crossed his lips, as though mocking the pain. "And so, I was left with nothing but the name Carlisle. I've survived on these streets ever since, learning to face the world alone." "Don't you feel anger?" Lillian asked, her voice trembling. Her heart ached as she imagined a child abandoned to the merciless streets. "Of course," Edward admitted, his gaze softening as it met hers. "But I won't let it consume me. Hatred doesn't keep you alive. What sustains me is the faint belief that goodness still exists." Lillian said nothing, but a swell of admiration rose within her. She didn't just pity Edward, she revered him. His endurance, his dignity, and the spark of kindness that persisted amidst such adversity captivated her. Unbeknownst to her, her visits were no longer solely about charity. She found herself drawn to his stories, his rare smiles, and the light in his soul that defied the shadows surrounding him. In Edward, she saw a beauty untarnished by suffering, and it kindled a warmth in her heart she hadn't felt before. Margaret Harrington sat in the grand parlor of the Harrington estate, her steely eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight on the table. Her fingers drummed rhythmically against the armrest of her chair, and a cold smile played on her lips. She could not tolerate the image of Lillian, with her naive compassion, growing closer to a lowly man like Edward Carlisle. To Margaret, this was not merely a disgrace, but a potential threat to the Harrington family's honor and her absolute control. When the servant announced Edward's arrival, Margaret's lips curled slightly. "Show him in," she said, her voice as smooth as velvet but as cold as ice. Edward entered, his wary eyes scanning the opulent room. In stark contrast to the lavish surroundings, he stood in his plain, worn attire, tall but visibly tense. He knew Margaret had not summoned him out of kidness. The air around her radiated danger with every calculated movement and word. "Mrs. Harrington," Edward said, striving to keep his voice steady. "You wanted to see me?" Margaret did not respond immediately. She gestured for the servant to leave the room, allowing a suspicious silence to settle. Then she rose and stepped toward Edward, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the wooden floor. "Mr. Carlisle," she began, her voice dripping with honeyed malice, "I have a proposal. An opportunity to change your life entirely." Edward's brows furrowed. "What kind of proposal, ma'am?" Margaret smiled, a chilling expression that sent shivers down the spine. She moved closer, her piercing gaze boring into his. "You will marry Lillian," she declared, her tone resolute. Her words made Edward freeze. He stared at Margaret, incredulous. "What did you just say? Marry her? Why?" "It's purely a matter of formality," Margaret continued, her voice light as though discussing a mere transaction. "You will become Lillian's husband, and in return, I will provide you with enough wealth to live the rest of your life in comfort. Haven't you always wanted an escape from your miserable circumstances? This is your chance." Edward stood motionless, his initial shock giving way to deep suspicion. "What do you want from me? This isn't an act of generosity. I don't believe you're doing this just to help." Margaret let out a mirthless laugh, turning her back to him to gaze out the large window overlooking the dimly lit garden. "You're right, Carlisle, this isn't charity, but you needn't concern yourself with my reasons. All you need to know is that you'll have everything: wealth, status, a life you could never dream of." Edward remained silent, her words an enticing trap laced with hidden threats. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice low, his caution evident. Margaret turned to face him, her icy eyes narrowing, her smile morphing into something cruel. "If you refuse, I'll ensure you never see daylight again. Those filthy streets you call home, I have the power to turn them into your personal hell, and I'm sure you understand. I never bluff." Edward swallowed hard, his hands balling into fists in his coat pockets to steady himself. "You want me to destroy Lillian's life," he said, his voice taut with restrained anger. "This isn't a marriage, it's a trap. You're trying to humiliate her, to make her a spectacle for society." Margaret shrugged, her expression unchanging. "Lillian needs to learn her place. The girl has forgotten where she belongs. You need only play your part, and things will be easier for both of us." A wave of fury surged in Edward's chest as he looked at the woman before him, willing to exploit her stepdaughter for her selfish gains. Yet, he also understood that rejecting her proposal would not only worsen his own plight, but could endanger Lillian. Margaret was not the sort to spare anyone who crossed her. Taking a deep breath, Edward steadied his voice. "I need time to think." Margaret nodded, her malicious smile never leaving her face. "I know you'll make the right choice, Carlisle. For your benefit and Lillian's." As Edward left the estate, his heart felt as heavy as stone. He glanced up at the starlit sky, wondering if he could protect Lillian from this sinister plot, or if he would be the one to contribute to her ruin. In the days leading up to the wedding, everything felt like a waking nightmare for Edward. He was no more than a puppet in Margaret's hands, dragged from one fitting room to another by servants and tailors who meticulously prepared every detail of his appearance. The luxurious wedding attire he wore brought no pride, only a profound sense of alienation and emptiness. Lillian fared no better. Forced to comply with every arrangement, from her resplendent bridal gown to the choreographed steps she was to take during the ceremony, her anguish and helplessness were evident in her eyes. She couldn't fight back. Margaret reigned supreme, and no one in the household dared question her authority. The night before the wedding, Edward felt suffocated in the guest chamber he had been assigned. The ornate walls adorned with oil paintings and the glittering crystal chandelier failed to mask the oppressive weight pressing on him. He needed air. Edward left the room, wandering through the vast hallways of the Harrington estate. Each step echoed against the marble floors, a stark reminder that this world was not his. Passing a guest washroom, Edward decided to step inside. He splashed water on his face, attempting to dispel the suffocating heaviness in his chest. As he looked up, his reflection stared back from the mirror, a man clad in aristocratic attire, yet with eyes that betrayed uncertainty and fear. The disconnect between his appearance and his reality was striking. As Edward exited, he accidentally bumped into an older gentleman. The impact caused the man to pause, bending down to pick up something that had fallen to the floor. "Is this yours?" the man asked, holding a small trinket, an old silver locket tarnished with time. Edward froze. It was the only keepsake he had from his childhood, a relic he carried as a reminder that he once had a family. "Yes, sir," Edward replied hastily, his voice trembling. He quickly retrieved the locket, gratitude flickering in his eyes, but as the gentleman scrutinized the locket before returning it, his expression shifted to one of surprise. "This locket," the man murmured, his voice low but clear, "this bears the emblem of the Carlisle family. How did you come by it?" Edward froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "You said Carlisle?" he asked, his voice catching. "You recognize it?" The man frowned, his gaze grave. "Of course. The Carlisles were one of the most distinguished families in the region, but tragedy struck years ago. The head of the family, Jonathan Carlisle, passed away suddenly, and his second wife, Margaret, seized control of everything. But there was a young boy, their son, who vanished without a trace." Edward felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. The man's words struck him like a thunderclap, stirring memories he had long suppressed. I don't know. This locket is the only thing I've had since I was a child," he admitted, his voice shaking. The man stared at Edward, his eyes wide with astonishment. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone solemn. "Edward Carlisle," he replied, barely above a whisper. The man stepped back, as though piecing together a puzzle. "It can't be, but your face, this locket, and your name." He looked at Edward, as if seeing a ghost. "You are the son of Jonathan Carlisle. There is no doubt you are the rightful heir to the Carlisle estate." Edward couldn't believe what he was hearing. The words felt surreal, yet deep down he knew they held truth. Fragmented memories of a kind father, a cold mansion, and a beautiful yet cruel stepmother began to crystallize. Margaret, the woman orchestrating the sham wedding, was the same person who had destroyed his family, stolen everything, and cast him aside. The gentleman placed a hand on Edward's shoulder, his gaze filled with compassion and resolve. "You cannot let her continue. You must reclaim what is yours, and if there is anything I can do to help, I will." Edward nodded, his heart igniting with determination. Now, he had more than one reason to confront Margaret. He would not only protect Lillian, but also bring justice for himself and his family. He would face Margaret head-on, and it would begin at the wedding, before everyone. The grand Harrington Chapel was bathed in the glow of countless candles, their light casting flickering shadows on the gray stone walls, creating an atmosphere both majestic and suffocating. Guests sat neatly arranged in rows, their curious whispers and discreet glances fixed on the young couple before the altar. But none among them suspected the tragic play of greed and deception unfolding beneath the grandeur of the ceremony. Lillian stood motionless in her pristine white gown, clutching her bouquet so tightly her fingers turned pale. Her face, though impeccably made up, could not hide the anguish and helplessness in her eyes. Each word uttered by the priest sounded like a death knell, dragging her deeper into an inescapable fate. Margaret sat in the front row, her cold eyes observing the scene with satisfaction, her lips curled in a smug smile. Beside Lillian, Edward stood clad in luxurious wedding attire, but the garments felt like a straitjacket. Every step toward the altar had been a march through guilt and doubt. He couldn't ignore the gnawing truth that he had become a pawn in Margaret's malevolent game, a truth that burned hotter with every passing moment. The priest's voice droned on, reciting the vows that sealed the farce. "If anyone here objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." The moment hung like a suspended breath. The chapel grew still as all eyes turned to the altar, expecting the silence to persist. But Edward, his blue eyes blazing with uncontainable resolve, took a step forward and broke the silence. The chapel erupted into murmurs of shock. Lillian's head snapped up, her wide eyes filled with confusion and alarm. Margaret narrowed her gaze, her lips pressed into a thin line like a wounded predator. "What are you doing?" Lillian whispered, her voice trembling with pain and fear. Edward turned to her, his eyes brimming with both sorrow and determination. "I can't let this continue. I can't let you suffer another moment because of this woman's schemes," he said, then directed his piercing gaze at Margaret. "You think I don't know the truth, Margaret?" Edward's voice carried through the chapel with unwavering strength. "I recognized you long ago. You are the woman who destroyed my family, abandoned me, and now you seek to do the same to Lillian." Margaret, though striving to maintain her composure, couldn't hide the flicker of panic in her eyes. What nonsense are you spewing, Carlisle? You're making baseless accusations to escape your responsibilities." Edward laughed bitterly, his voice laced with contempt. "Baseless? Have you forgotten me so easily, Margaret? Or did you think I'd never have the chance to remember the truth? I am Edward Carlisle, the son of Jonathan Carlisle, the boy you discarded after stealing everything." His words thundered through the chapel, silencing every murmur. Guests stared at Margaret with expressions of shock and disbelief. Lillian raised her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. No, no, this cannot be. Margaret stumbled back, but Edward pressed forward, his eyes sharp as a blade. You thought your secrets would remain buried forever? No, Margaret. The truth always finds a way to surface. Margaret tried to respond, but the words died in her throat. From the front row, Robert Harrington, Lillian's father, rose shakily to his feet, clutching the pew for support. Margaret, what Edward says, is it true? He asked, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with bewilderment and betrayal. Margaret's silence was answer enough. Edward turned to Lillian, his gaze softening. Lillian, I'm sorry for letting this go on for so long, but I won't let you be a victim any longer. I'll protect you, no matter the cost. The Harrington chapel was engulfed in a suffocating silence. Edward's revelations thundered through the hallowed space, shattering its solemn tranquility. The entire congregation sat frozen, the air heavy with tension, broken only by Margaret's ragged breathing. Her hands gripped the armrest of her chair, knuckles white as marble, but her eyes, once sharp and cold, now flickered with sheer panic. This cannot be, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. You're lying. But Edward stood firm, his gaze ablaze with the fire of truth. You abandoned me, Margaret. You destroyed my family, and now seek to ruin Lillian's life. But you can't hide from the truth forever. At that moment, the echo of a cane striking the stone floor resonated from the chapel's entrance. All eyes turned toward the grand doors, where the elderly nobleman, Reginald Carter, who had identified Edward through the locket, stepped in with an air of solemn authority. He struck his cane once more, the sound reverberating like a definitive proclamation. I, Lord Reginald Carter, stand here today as a witness to Edward Carlisle's words, he declared, his voice resonating through the tense atmosphere. The locket he carries is not merely a keepsake. It is irrefutable proof that he is the son of Jonathan Carlisle, the rightful heir to the Carlisle estate, which this woman, he gestured to Margaret, stole when she entered his life. Margaret flinched, her panicked eyes darting across the room, searching for an escape. She tried to maintain her composure, but her trembling hands betrayed her crumbling facade. Lord Carter, she croaked, her voice hoarse, you cannot rely on a tarnished trinket to pass judgment. Everything he says is slander. But Reginald remained unfazed. This locket bears the Carlisle family crest, a symbol reserved solely for the rightful heir. And if you still deny it, I have retrieved from the family archives a copy of Edward's birth certificate. Edward Carlisle is Hudson Carlisle, the only son of Jonathan Carlisle and his first wife. The congregation collectively held its breath. Whispers broke out among the guests, their murmurs filled with shock and outrage. All eyes turned toward Margaret, their judgment clear in their expressions. Robert Harrington, who had been standing as if paralyzed, now sank into his seat as though the weight of the revelations had drained him of all strength. His bloodshot eyes brimmed with anguish as he turned to Margaret. "Margaret," he rasped, his voice cracking. "Tell me, is all of this true?" Margaret whipped around to face Robert, her eyes wide with desperation. "Robert, I don't know what he's talking about. This is all a misunderstanding, a conspiracy." "Enough!" Robert's voice thundered, cutting her off for the first time. "You've been deceiving me all these years, haven't you? You claimed to love me, to protect this family, but it was all lies." His shoulders shook as his voice choked with raw emotion. "I was blind to trust you. You not only destroyed Edward's family, but also manipulated mine. How could you do this to Lillian, my daughter?" Margaret staggered backward, her hands clawing at the back of her chair. "Robert, I did it all for you, for this family. Lillian needed to learn her place, to understand her role. By forcing her to marry a man you deemed beneath her," Robert roared, his eyes blazing with a fury Margaret had never seen. "No, Margaret, this wasn't for our family. It was for your power, for your insatiable greed." Margaret's confidence crumbled entirely. She turned to Lillian, who stood motionless, her face pale but resolute. "Lillian, you must believe me. Everything I did was for you." But Lillian met her stepmother's gaze with icy detachment. "You never did anything for me. Everything you did was for yourself." Lillian's words were the final blow, severing the last thread of Margaret's carefully woven web. She looked around the chapel, her desperate eyes searching for an ally, but all she found were cold, disdainful stares. No one stepped forward to defend her. The chapel fell into a deathly silence. Margaret, once the epitome of control and dominance, now looked like a cornered animal. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, seeking an escape, but every path was blocked. From the back of the chapel, Reginald Carter strode forward, his cane striking the stone floor with steady purpose. His piercing gaze bore into Margaret, his expression one of utter condemnation. "Margaret Carlisle, the time has come for you to face justice," he declared, his voice low and commanding. Margaret spun around to face him, clinging to her last shred of defiance. "Reginald, you have no authority to do this. This is the Harrington estate. I have done nothing wrong," she shrieked, her voice shrill and grating like shattered glass. Reginald remained unmoved. He stopped before Margaret, his face etched with disdain. "Did you think you could live in deceit forever? I alerted the authorities the moment I uncovered evidence against you. It's over, Margaret. Your reign of lies ends here." At that moment, heavy footsteps echoed through the chapel as two uniformed officers entered, their presence radiating authority. "Margaret Carlisle, you are under arrest for fraud, abuse of power, and suspected involvement in the death of Jonathan Carlisle," one officer announced, his voice firm and unyielding. Margaret staggered back, her hands clutching her gown as though trying to salvage her remaining dignity. "No, you cannot do this to me. I am Lady Harrington," she screamed, her voice a mix of fury and despair. The officers approached, gripping her arms firmly. Margaret thrashed wildly, her struggles only adding to her pitiful display. Her frantic eyes darted to Robert, pleading for salvation. "Robert, you can't let them do this. Everything I did was for our family, for you." Robert, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, now stood as though turned to stone. His tear-streaked face bore the weight of betrayal and sorrow. "For me, Margaret? No. You did it all for yourself, for your ambition." His voice cracked with every word, as though each syllable tore at his soul. "You didn't just deceive me. You destroyed my family, and I let it happen." Margaret's eyes widened in horror as the full weight of her isolation hit her. She had no allies left. Every lie, every justification crumbled to dust. As the officers led her away, her hands fell limp, her voice reduced to a broken whisper. "No, This cannot be. As the chapel doors closed behind Margaret, the sound reverberated like the final punctuation to years of deceit and tragedy. An oppressive silence followed, broken only by Robert's labored breaths. He collapsed into the front pew, his face buried in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. Edward stepped forward, standing silently by Robert's side. He knew words could do little to ease the man's torment. Finally, Robert raised his tear-streaked face, his red-rimmed eyes meeting Lillian's. "I've let you suffer too much, Lillian," he choked out, his voice hoarse with regret. "I was blind to her manipulations, blind to everything. I don't deserve to be your father." Lillian knelt before him, gently placing her hand over his trembling ones. "Father, you don't need to atone. I don't blame you," she said softly, her voice steady yet full of compassion. "All I need is for you to be true to yourself. Don't let anyone control you again." Robert looked at his daughter, his eyes brimming with guilt and love. "I promise, Lillian, I'll make things right. Even if it's late, I'll do what's right." Reginald stepped forward, his gaze resting on Edward. "Mr. Carlisle," he said, his voice stern yet warm, "you stood up against injustice, and now you have not only reclaimed justice for yourself, but for everyone who was manipulated by Margaret. I am proud of you." Edward nodded, feeling an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. He glanced at Lillian, who was still comforting her father, and an unfamiliar peace filled his heart. At last, he knew he was no longer alone. The shattered fragments of the past had been pieced together, and the future, though full of challenges, was finally opening before them. Edward and Lillian's small home, located on the southern outskirts of London, was far from the grandeur of the Harrington estate, but it overflowed with warmth and laughter. It became the starting point of their new life, one no longer dominated by ambition or schemes, but by love and compassion. They chose to hold their wedding in the backyard under the gentle sunlight of an early spring afternoon. Only close friends, a few colleagues from the charity they had founded, and a simple, warm atmosphere surrounded them. No extravagant gowns, no noble guests, just sincere smiles and loving glances. Lillian, radiant in a simple white dress, had never looked more beautiful. Her eyes sparkled with trust and joy as she stood beside Edward. Edward, dressed in a modest gray suit, held her hand as though afraid that if he let go, the precious happiness they had found might slip away. "When you walked into my life, Lillian," Edward said in his vows, his voice deep and filled with emotion, "you lit up my darkest places. You are the only light I've ever known, and today I vow to spend the rest of my life protecting that light." Lillian smiled, her eyes glistening. "And you, Edward, have shown me that even in the greatest adversity, kindness and perseverance can prevail. You've taught me to believe in people, and today I promise to stand by your side, not just in love, but in the journey we're beginning together." The simple yet heartfelt vows moved everyone in attendance. The small chapel was bathed in the soft afternoon sunlight, further highlighting the honest beauty of the moment as Edward and Lillian shared their first kiss as husband and wife. Applause erupted, not loud, but filled with warmth, blending with the happiness of the couple and all those who witnessed their union. After their wedding, Edward and Lillian did not choose the path of luxury that could have been theirs. Instead, they poured their hearts into building a charity named London's Light, a name inspired by the light they had found in their darkest days. The charity was not just a place for food or temporary shelter, but a beacon of hope for those forgotten by society. They established warm, welcoming shelters where the homeless were treated with respect and genuine care. Free education centers were created, giving orphaned children and impoverished families a chance to transform their lives. In the charity kitchens, Edward and Lillian often worked side by side, not as leaders but as equals, listening to and sharing in the stories of the people they served. Edward, in particular, frequently visited London's poorest areas, offering his ear and his empathy to those who, like him, had endured life's harshest trials. Years passed, and London's light became a symbol of unity and compassion. The shelters expanded, the education centers welcomed hundreds of children, and the streets, once plagued by hunger and cold, began to shine with smiles and hope. Thank you for joining us on Edward and Lillian's journey. If their story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to help us reach a meaningful milestone, our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support is a tremendous encouragement, empowering us to continue sharing inspirational stories of kindness and connection. See you in the next story.